Many people are just waiting for the strategy to help them feel better so they can do the thing.
Yeah.
But it's doing the thing that's actually going to feed back and help them feel better, not the other way around.
I think that's the biggest thing that people are missing out on when they say they've done everything. They're kind of waiting for that thought challenging to make them miraculously go, not scared of that anymore. You don't have to wait for that miracle thought challenging to make you suddenly not scared. Hi guys, and welcome back to Connected and Uncensored. I am your host, Michaela Overman, and today I am joined by a super special guest. Corrie Ackland is the director and lead clinical psychologist at Sydney Phobia Clinic, but she was also one of the, if not the main reason why I cope with and handle my anxiety and my phobias as well as I do, because she was my therapist before. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Welcome.
And thank you for helping me be who I am today. I mean, you've had such a big impact on my life. So thank you so much.
You're most welcome. I'm glad to hear it.
So I thought I'd bring Corrie on today because obviously I think she's the bee's knees, but I think she's got a wealth of knowledge to be able to share with you all. And I guess I would love for you to start with sharing kind of a little bit about your job and what it is that you specifically do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the founder of Sydney Phobia Clinic. And so we opened our doors back in 2016 as the first of its kind dedicated phobia practice.
Mm-hmm.
But that's born out of my time working with severe anxiety presentation. So before that, I did a stint at an OCD clinic and worked with severe anxieties and phobia. Actually was a very small part of the work there. But I absolutely fell in love with anxiety, if you can say that.
Love that.
And I certainly, I love working with it. I love treating it. I get it. I've experienced it. All humans experience it. And so I find it a fascinating area to work with, but it's also a super rewarding area to work with. And out of that work and identifying that there are still some challenges in treating it in a private practice setting, we opened the doors of Sydney Phobia Clinic. That just really allowed us to drill down on phobias specifically and make sure that we're able to provide evidence-based treatment, which is exposure therapy. And the whole clinic is really built around being more hands-on as a private practice in the treatment of anxiety.
Yeah. While we're on that topic, can you give a bit of an understanding of the difference between anxiety, like general anxiety disorder, and a phobia, like the difference in how it maybe feels for a person or presents for a person?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people go around talking about anxiety as if anxiety in and about itself is a diagnosable condition, but it's not. Anxiety is importantly a collection of symptoms and mostly bodily symptoms, but there's some cognitive or thought-based aspects to that, as you well know. And so when we're looking at the anxiety disorders, they are actually quite different, but the predominant feature of them, what they share, is that collection of anxiety symptoms, right? And so, what we tend to see distinguish them is, well, what is that anxiety attaching to and how are we responding to that anxiety?
Right.
When we're looking at a generalized anxiety disorder, we can otherwise consider it more a pathological worry condition. It's more about the cognitive aspect of anxiety and the uncontrollable worries and thoughts that, because they are threat-based, because they are worries, will trigger the anxiety feelings. But when we treat a generalized anxiety disorder, we're really looking at managing the worry more so in a lot of ways than the anxiety or our responding to the worry. When we're looking at a phobia, it is when that anxiety attaches to a really specific situation, object, and becomes a kind of habitual responding in that way. And it's more of a behavioral approach in that. And exposure is the primary component of that. And then we have other anxiety disorders, panic disorder, agoraphobia, social anxiety. And so they all have their little nuances. And, obviously every individual presenting with these disorders are also different, but they are different in their own right, even though they share the predominant experience of anxiety.
And so with the phobias, smart. Okay, so with the treatment of, well, actually, let's just jump back a little bit here, because you did touch on the fact that you yourself experienced anxiety. Do you mind sharing with the listeners a little bit around what your experience with mental health struggle has looked like?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I myself have ADHD, and there's a myriad of difficulties that can come along with that. Throughout my teenage years, I did suffer from panic attacks, and that's an infrequent experience for me now, but I'm not going to say that it's without its occurrences. And looking into my future, I would expect that I'll probably have another one or few. And so, the ADHD was my main struggle and everything that comes along with that. And certainly in my teenage years, that was particularly difficult, but managed better now. I've also struggled with complicated grief after losing my father. I've struggled with anxiety around my kids. This is the fun thing about being a human with, our mental health. It ebbs and flows, and we manage it better or worse as well, depending on the resources that you had available to us.
I do remember in one session you saying, when we were working on different anxieties and worries, okay, but the one about your kids, Michaela, that's just not going to go. That's just normal. Let's just accept it. It is what it is. Everybody has them. And I think it's really beneficial for people to hear, because that moment for me was really, really powerful. It kind of normalized that, okay, so it's not my, generalized anxiety disorder. It's normal. I think hearing a lot of these things, what I've shared about my mental health journey, or you sharing these experiences, it's nice for people to hear that it is normal. And I also love hearing what you said, it might come and go again in your future, because a really big takeaway message I love viewers to take on here is healing is not linear, and loving yourself in every single stage of it, whatever it looks like, and accepting that is the most important part, because you might be struggling, and then in a month, 2 months, 2 years, you might be thriving, and then you might slip back and struggle. But slip back's probably the wrong word, because it's all projecting you forward. It's all a part
Facing
of
new
the
challenges.
healing.
And
And things that life throws at you, and then it reopens old wounds or old habits and patterns. And as long as you've got that really good toolbox, and this is something that I would love for people to focus on and consciously develop, what does your toolbox look like? Because what works really well for me might not work really well for you, and for a whole bunch of people. And I guess that's one of the main things I wanted to chat to you about, was developing that toolbox for people, and maybe helping them think just in general, for looking after your mental health, what are some things that you think everybody should have in their mental health toolbox?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is looking at the lifestyle aspects, right? Because we are human beings and we have some really basic needs. And if those basic needs aren't being met, then we're going to have a really hard time doing any of these higher order things, which is often what we're working on in therapy. But we want to make sure that foundation is solid. And that foundation is pretty straightforward, not to say that it's easy to establish and maintain. And we're talking about good sleep, good diet, and movement. And so when those things are in a good place, well, then that supports our attention, it supports our mood, and it also supports our anxiety levels just at that base. So that is always the first thing that I hope to be able to change for someone coming in. And it's something you can change just straight away, right? It doesn't require much learning to understand, what a good sleep looks like, what good diet looks like, and how to move your body. But beyond that, there are things that we can do from an acute management point of view. When anxiety is triggered, understanding what it is important. So understanding that it is an activated threat response, that basically our body's gone into something of a run or a sprint. And what we need to do first and foremost is catch our breath. So a good habit around breathing regulation is also a really important one that gets quite a lot of eye rolls in therapy, as you would know from your experience as a therapist. But, there's not one way to do it. And I think it is just being able to get comfortable doing a bit of that reset. And then that enables you to turn your mind to, well, what might have triggered that? And being able to come at that a little bit more rationally or apply a rational thought to what might have irrationally gone on in the mind. Hard to do without those other things in place.
Yeah.
And then it's trying to line up the behaviors with what that rational thought is. And so being able to go, okay, well, if I can accept that this is a more realistic thought or a more realistic way to view this situation, what does that charge me to do? And then obviously practice can help with that. But that practice part is a bit harder, you know, in a lot of cases. And from a tool point of view, making sure that we're starting off in a good spot, having a good breathing strategy to go to, and then being able to call out some of those thoughts is a good start.
So essentially shifting your inner voice and breathing exercises are the two most powerful tools.
They're the most powerful tools, but I would say the most important part is the behavior.
Yes.
Right? So the behavior change is the most important part at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And those tools can help in modifying that behavior if it's hard to get started on otherwise.
So giving everybody a bit of an example of what you've done for me with this exact situation would be my fear of flying, which is the original reason why I saw Corrie and she opened Pandora's box. But I would have a thought that, you know, what was that sound? It must be something catastrophic. I'm in control here, so how do I fix it? I would have to challenge the thought after making sure I had, you know, tried to regulate my nervous system with some deep belly breathing, which was really, really hard in those moments. But try and challenge that thought to whatever we had come up with prior on how I could challenge it. But then matching the behavior with that would look like me saying, okay, well, if I genuinely believed that that sound is normal or that sound is irrelevant to me because the pilots are in control or whatever the thought challenge, if I actually believed that, the behavior that I would do would be put my headphones back in and keep watching the movie, or don't press the call button for the 50th time and ask for a flight attendant to ask what the noise was. And so I guess that was like pairing up, matching the behavior to my thought challenge was the biggest game changer, because that's not me saying that I wasn't sitting there going, it's fucking bullshit, I need to ask what that sound was. Like, oh my God, I am still thinking those things, not anymore, but I was still thinking those things. But the more evidence you give your brain of the behavior matching its new thought, the less likely it'll have those thoughts again later, or the less likely it'll pack as much of a punch. So I would then just sit there and, you know, look at the movie screen and be like, okay, I'm not going to ask this question. And I guess that's a good example of what you mean with matching the behavior to the thought challenge.
Yeah, because I think where some people can go wrong is they might do that other work. They might change their thought.
Yeah.
But then they don't change the behavior. And so actually nothing changes.
Yes.
Right? Because our brains are just little learning machines. But the main way that they learn is based on, well, what did we do and what was the outcome?
Yes.
And so if we keep those maladaptive behaviors in, then that is still perpetuating that unhelpful learning, even though you're doing all of that work from a body and a thought point of view. But nothing may really change.
Yeah. And this applies to absolutely everything. I mean, having a client of mine talking about not interjecting in a disagreement with their sibling and their parent because they want to make sure nothing catastrophic happens. And I'm saying, you know, what would the behavior be of somebody that genuinely believed it is not in my control, the outcome of their situation? Well, they would go back into their room and chill on their bed. And, you know, as much as they wanted to not do that, it's kind of, that's where the change happens because they match the behaviors.
Yeah.
Okay. So what would be a way that people could start doing that? Would it be like writing down things that do cause them worry and stress and trying to then write as many examples of the behaviors they do that kind of stem off those worries and then how they could change those?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, I think that there's kind of two potential approaches, and one of it is being a bit more anxiety driven. So looking at what are all of the things that worry me? What are all of the things that trigger that anxiety? I'm going to rank them from the things that are, easiest to hardest. And I'm just going to go about practicing the easiest ones to get them off the list and then move up. And that's quite a traditional way of doing it. We call it an exposure hierarchy or a step ladder. But another option is to look at it from a goals point of view, right? So what do I actually want to achieve? What are my goals? And how far away from that am I? And actually doing a bit of a step ladder in terms of what are the steps that I might need to take, that I might need to practice to get me from where I am now to meet that goal. And certainly when it comes to things like a fear of flying, where there might be a flight booked in, we might not have the time to go through the anxiety-driven approach. It might be about going, okay, well, how do we break down this goal into its more relevant steps to get us there kind of quicker because we're going anyway, rather than taking what can sometimes be a slower, but also maybe a gentler approach.
Yeah. So that might look more like, so you probably are going to panic when you're up there. How do we manage the panic?
Yeah. Or, in the case where it might be a claustrophobia that's related to a fear of flying, well, we might still be going into more flying specific practice, even though an easier step might be to play in the lifts.
Yeah. Play in them.
Yeah. That's
okay.
That's the job.
Yeah.
I'm always playing in
Yeah. I like it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's just like your general, this is what's great for mental health. Do you feel then with phobias, it's phobia specific for the treatment? I mean, to someone it's going to be, but especially with like flying, you can fight it and combat it with a lot of nice, lovely facts. But what actually the most common one that people write to me about is health anxiety, which I put up a video explaining that is something that I very much have experienced as well. I would love for you to maybe give, what are some of the tips that you would give someone specifically with health anxiety?
Yeah. And so it's a good example because it does actually sit a little bit different to a phobia, because with a phobia, we recognize that the thought error there is, I've misinterpreted the danger of this situation. And so I can now counter that misinterpretation with facts around the probabilities or whatever. When we're looking at health anxiety, unfortunately, it's often the case that we're not misinterpreting anything specific. It's more that there is an uncertainty that isn't being tolerated, right? We can't really get the facts reasonably either, or, to get the facts would be in and about itself a maladaptive maintaining behavior, right? Running up to the doctor, getting tests, Google researching, all of these things only keeps that cycle maintained of worrying about health, triggering what can be something of a compulsive behavior to try to get certainty, which continues to keep a poor tolerance of uncertainty. And then round and round and round we go, because there's always something in this body that we could be worrying about or focusing on. So instead of challenging that thought, we would actually be challenging that thought process, right? Not the content. And we would be looking at trying to disengage from the worry rather than act on the worry. And so it looks just that little bit different from what we do in the cognitive element.
Yeah. It's actually stepping away from focusing on what is causing your anxiety and instead focusing more on like physiologically what anxiety is doing to you and trying to calm that.
Yeah, or recognize that this was a thought that intruded, or, my attention went to this part of my body unnecessarily. And the more we then don't follow that, well, then hopefully that isn't a habit that we continue to go to, and we get better and better at tolerating the fact that that's just a thought, that's just a feeling. I don't need to do whatever it is that I was doing to be safe, because actually I was already safe, for getting more confidence in that.
So the brain builds more and more evidence when, let's say, someone has a pang in their head and they go to, well, I have a brain tumor or an aneurysm, and then they don't do the behaviors of Googling or reaching out to a friend or booking a doctor's appointment. They have picked up on what behaviors go with that, and they don't do them anymore. And then the next day they wake up and they're fine. it's that reoccurring buffer building up of going, oh, okay, so it wasn't that I went and checked myself out at the doctor or Googled or whatever that made me wake up alive or wake up. It actually was all okay. It's more that positive feedback loop.
That's right. And so what we would hope is that then the next time we experience particularly that trigger, we're just that little bit better able to not engage that behavior, and it gets easier and easier and easier and easier. And then we hope that it will generalize to other triggers that are similar.
What about, because I can imagine, I mean, the response I get when I explain something like that to certain people, but I can imagine you've heard it a million times as well. I can't possibly do that. I'm in a state of panic. Like how do I do that? It kind of ties in the beginning when you said the best thing that you can do. And I mean, this is why I think I connected so well with you from a therapy standpoint of you being my therapist. Your go-to is always, well, physical exercise and nutrition is the most important thing first. But I get the same answers there from people where it's like, how do I do that though when I do not want to, or I can't bring myself to get out of bed, or it's too hard, I'm too panicked. For any of the fears and phobias / tools even, how do you go around handling somebody saying something like that? Like, it's too hard.
And I think that's where that proactive practice comes in, because in that moment when that trigger hits, it is just full panic. But if we know that that's a trigger, well, we can start practicing our response to that ahead of time, right? We can start introducing things that might trigger it in an easier way. So we can practice regulating the body, regulating the mind, not engaging with that as a trigger, building up confidence, building up habit, so that when that does come up more randomly and in a way that would previously have been, just a definite panic, there's already some skill and some habit.
Yeah. What about on the exercise and nutrition front when people, because the evidence is like immeasurable on the impact that it has on mental health, but the amount of people with depression especially that would say, well, can you give me a fucking different answer? Because I'm not going to exercise. Or I have all the good intentions to exercise and eat well, Michaela, but no, didn't do it.
And, and I was also that person that just didn't have the time.
Or the energy or the want.
It's, unfortunately, it is the case that it is so hard to get started on these things and to adhere to it. And in those first stages, the reward isn't always there. However, like you said, the research is there, and also the evidence in people around us is also there. We all know someone who is, adhering to these practices and reporting that they're feeling great for it. It's very rare you hear someone that goes, I'm working out every day, I'm eating really healthy, and I hate it. I feel like shit. So, that hopefully can provide some motivation. But if it isn't intrinsically motivating, then we might lead to, well, how do we otherwise motivate? What might be some extrinsic motivations? And maybe it is getting someone else to hold us accountable, right? Maybe, movement can come in so many different ways. It doesn't have to be doing a triathlon or going and joining a gym. Maybe it is having a lunch date with a friend, but committing to walking there. Just trying to find a way that we're bringing that movement in. We actually don't need a lot. I think it's about 10 minutes 3 times a week, or, it isn't actually much to start lifting the mood in particular, if that's our goal over other kinds of health and fitness goals.
I guess it's a similar concept then to changing anxious thoughts. Start with the small, easy things, like maybe not interfering in a parental disagreement, if that's my biggest end outcome, for example, for a client. It's just the one that comes to mind. But it might be, okay, well, in the morning when you want to put away something so it doesn't irritate your parent, maybe don't, start there, starting as small as possible. I guess it's kind of the same here. It's, you don't have to exercise 6 times a week, 7 times a week. It might be just try and do 10 minutes 3 times a week, just helping your nervous system get that positive feedback loop happening. An example of different version of that. And I wonder if you ever recommend this to clients. When I do have clients that either can't exercise for physical reasons or genuinely just the smallest step is too overwhelming for them, we go through the muscle tensing exercise, which I say to them, even if you get to the end of the day and you haven't exercised, you can do this one in bed before you go to sleep. And it's like tensing your feet as hard as you can, but really, really visualizing, like in your mind, like trying to picture every little muscle, every little bone in your feet, 30 seconds as hard as you can, relaxing, and then progressively adding in more muscle groups. So eventually you're like laying in your bed like a stiff, like a board, tensing everything, because essentially your brain getting the message that muscles are under tension is getting the message that you're exercising. So it can have similar impact as exercising on the nervous system. Unfortunately, not on like building muscle or anything cardiovascular fitness. But what do you think about that tool for people who want to take the approach of exercise for mental health but can't or don't want to?
Yeah, look, I think, again, recognizing that exercise does come in many different forms, and it could be some stretching, or it could be some dancing, or, there's a number of different ways. When it comes to progressive muscle relaxation, we probably use that more in our acute anxiety management, or even as a mindfulness practice for people. So a very common one used for fear of flying as well, because there's a lot of waiting around, and PMR takes, some 20 minutes. But yeah, when it does come to exercise, and to get, if we're specifically wanting mood benefits, we would probably be wanting a little bit more than a progressive muscle relaxation.
Yeah.
But but anything's a start, and if that is something that can build self-efficacy towards
Going for a walk,
then absolutely. And if reading a story about someone going for a walk is a motivating step for someone to take that step themselves, then I'm all for that as well. It's meeting a client where they're at, and again, just trying to bridge this gap between where they are and
where they want to get.
Where they want to get.
Right. So with the toolbox that you help clients develop, because I personally kind of shifted into half of it's proactive, half of it's reactive tools. A bunch of them overlap, like physical exercise, I say is needed in your proactive toolbox, that it's just done every day, but it's also part of the reactive toolbox. If you are spiraling, if you are feeling overwhelmed or anxious, getting up out of where you are and not ruminating and just going for a walk around the block, because physical exercise is the number one way to regulate your nervous system. Are there any other tools, I guess it's a two-part question, that you think are great to overlap that you haven't mentioned for both proactive and reactive? And are there any more reactive ones, like, pack a punch? Because the proactive ones are probably the most important to do, but I think some people need some reactive ones far up their sleeve for those big moments.
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to the proactive ones, practice, and really look at what ways that we can participate more fully in the lives that we want. When it comes to the reactive ones, we've obviously spoken about breathing strategies and thought challenging, or otherwise thought disengaging. But the other ones would be mindfulness, grounding. These are things that we can just try. All of these, what we're trying to do is take our attention away from where it's not helpful and invest it into something that is going to be more helpful in that moment.
Yeah. So when you say mindfulness, can you share some of the best ways that you recommend people engage in mindfulness?
Yeah. So mindfulness, I know it's kind of taken the psych world by storm. And so there's a number of ways that we can practice it proactively, like as a drill. And the more that we do that, the better able we will likely be to roll that out when we really need it. But again, really what we're looking at is that cognitive flexibility, that ability to bring all of our attention to the task at hand, to the present moment, especially when something else is trying to pull our attention away, such as a trigger or, an uncomfortable thought or feeling. And so we are just playing with attention in that way. And choosing what that anchor is for that attention and dragging our attention onto it. And I often think about sitting in a classroom, in high school, in a really boring lesson, and the attention just wants to either go out the window or think about the fun stuff that we're going to do on the weekend. But we know we've got to listen to what the teacher's talking about, and so dragging the attention back. It's probably going to go again, dragging the attention back.
Yeah.
And the more we do that, then obviously the more we're getting out of the present moment, even if it's broken and in bits, but we're also developing that skill.
Yeah, building the muscle.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that you recommended to me, and then I recommend to my own clients, is finding everyday things that you're just going to do anyway and making them mindful moments. Because if you are anything like me and you have to carve out time in your day to sit and meditate or be mindful, it'll just feel like it's on my to-do list, and that just makes me more overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So I instead, when I brush my teeth, that's my mindfulness every single day. I tell my kids when they have a shower, I kind of talk through with them. I'm like, wait, how does the water feel on your body? And like, we really try and be so in that shower that nothing else matters. And I say, like, oh, what does it feel like? Where is it hitting your body the most? Because I mean, obviously they're very young. I can't just say, be mindful in the shower one day. But I think it's really great for people to just realize that it doesn't have to be this big carved out thing. You can tack it on to anything, because like you said, it's just helping your brain focus on what you're choosing to focus it on, and it's going to slip away a million times. That's okay, but bringing it back and strengthening that muscle of being able to be in the present moment.
And you get the most out of those activities, obviously, when you're paying attention to them. And then this becomes important in other clinical models. You know, when we're looking at scheduling enjoyable activities, for example, for clinical depression, well, you can be going through the motions of doing an enjoyable activity, but if you're actually not focusing on it because you're ruminating, you're not getting the best out of that. So being able to be mindful of your enjoyable activities gets that enjoyment out of it. Or similarly, if we're, going for a walk to get our mind off worries, it's not necessarily going to get our mind off the worry. We could worry and walk. Whereas if we recognize that the walk is actually about, being outside, feeling the air, moving our body, these are all things that we could actually be focusing on. And then our focus isn't on the unhelpful aspect, but it's actually on, the task at hand and what that could be providing for us.
Yeah. So, I mean, switching it up a little bit, but sounds like it's very, very similar tasks. You mentioned ADHD earlier. And obviously the comorbidity between having anxiety and having ADHD is really high. Do you feel like there's a difference in the tools that you're going to use to manage the two of them?
The tools aren't different, but how they might be adhered to tends to be different. When we're looking at ADHD, it's, again, important to recognize that what we're talking about is dysregulation, right? And difficulty with the start, stay, stop, our executive functions. And this can apply to our thoughts. The thoughts can just be impulsive. They can just run away, and it can be different to bring them back. Emotions can do the same. They can impulsively bolt. They can be really, really big and really, really fast, and difficult to regulate them. Behaviors the same. So when these are treatment targets, to, for example, challenge a thought and refocus back onto the task at hand, someone with an ADHD brain style might find that really, really difficult, and in particular to get in front of thoughts. So to be more realistic, we're going to go, your brain's going to bolt, and it's probably going to bolt 50 times. It's not about the fact that it's bolted. It's about how we practice bringing it back. And it's the same with the emotions. Again, those emotions can be a lot stronger, and it's trying to be, I guess, gentle about the fact that happens, not getting frustrated and thinking like, oh man, this isn't working, but rather going like, yep, this is what my emotions do because this is the brain style. And it's more about how we guide it back.
And calling it a brain style, I think, is a really important thing to clarify, and a way of wording that I really love that you do, because so many of my viewers actually have ADHD, and they kind of feel like it's something that they need to fix. And I guess I feel that's a bit of a difference between anxiety and ADHD. I guess it depends on the type of anxiety, but for a lot of anxiety, you can learn to manage that and you can probably lessen it dramatically, if not remove it. Well, you can never remove anxiety fully, but with ADHD, it's how your brain is wired. It's a brain type. It's nothing to fix. There's nothing, but it's more about learning how to thrive with your style of brain rather than it being anything wrong with it or one that you need to get out of, because that's just how your brain is wired.
Yeah, so I mean, I would agree when we're looking at specifically anxiety disorders, they are theoretically acute conditions that are treatable and some more successfully than others. ADHD is not something that will be treated away. There is many things that we can do that can minimize the difficulties that ADHD can pose in life to a point where it might be completely gone from that situation. And even in the DSM, so our Bible as psychologists, it says just that. It says that the symptoms can be completely absent in the right conditions. And so that's what we would be trying to achieve from managing ADHD, is that all of the brain needs are met, so it's not playing up. But that is a management thing, and it is a lifelong management thing, and it changes depending on the context, depending on interest, depending on stimulation, and unfortunately for women gets thrown all about the place by hormones, so new and exciting challenges that come along with that as well. But it's learning how to manage that brain style and specifically how it manifests for each individual.
Okay. The last question I have, we've kind of spoken about it already, but it feels like I haven't done it justice. I get a lot of messages, specifically with people saying that they've tried medication, they've tried doing all the things that they're meant to do, and they still have really bad anxiety or they still have really bad depression. What can I do? That's something I read probably 2 or 3 times a day. I guess we kind of have answered it in the sense that if I said to them, are you actually, exercising every day and eating as well as you can to fuel your body and doing breathing exercises and trying to match your behaviors to the thought challenges, but let's assume somebody is like, yes, I'm genuinely doing all those things. Is the last step just acceptance that this is?
So, I mean, I would say absolutely there is a level of anxiety symptoms and mood lability, the ups and downs that we have to accept because they are part of the normal human experience, and that normal range is a range, right? So there is going to be those individual differences. When I see someone that is literally doing all of the things and they're still struggling with symptoms that are quite clearly outside of a normal acceptable range, they're causing impact and impairment in their day-to-day life when they're trying to do, just really a normal life, I would be looking at what's getting in the way because, again, our brains have an amazing capacity to learn lifelong, and most of this, we are just talking about learning. So why isn't the brain learning? Why isn't the brain learning that these situations that we are engaging in do not need our threat response, if we are doing all the things to support that? Sometimes, unfortunately, people can get a little bit compulsive, even with treatment, right? They can become compulsive with breathing strategies. They can become compulsive with their mental health management. They can, be spending all of their everyday focusing on their inner experiences and then trying to apply a strategy to manage it. But, that's not normal life either, right? So it might be that there is an overdoing of that is reducing their tolerance to that normal range or stopping the brain from just turning off and playing with other ideas and playing with other experiences and almost getting the brain hooked on mental health.
Yeah. I feel like that's something that's more and more prevalent with how much like self-help is spoken about, that people almost go on this like quest to fix themselves without actually really taking on properly the tools that they are reading about or practicing or feeling like they are a problem to solve. So I can imagine that definitely is one boat. The other being, I guess, probably there is one of those tools that you aren't doing, and it's about working with a professional to figure out which one it is.
Or it could be being done with the best intentions.
Yeah.
But there might just be something that's missing with that. And certainly that's what I found in some of my work, that, you know, again, people might be challenging their thinking, but they're not refocusing. You know, they're engaging in a discussion, in a debate. Yeah, but well, what if? And on it goes and on it goes. Whereas again, you know, thought challenging is a specific strategy that we apply, and then it's about the behavior change. It's about refocusing away from it.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's just one example of how someone might come in and say, I'm doing it. But when we look at it, it's like, oh, we're actually missing the mark there a little bit with how that's actually being practiced.
So I just want to give one last example so that it's, because it is probably the most powerful thing that you taught, is matching the behaviors to the thought. And I also am cognizant of the fact that this podcast episode has made it seem like I've had every fucking anxiety under the sun. But I also was afraid of wind. And I remember I like giving examples to as many situations as possible. But I remember you said you are allowed to challenge it with one thought. So, okay, it's really windy. What if the windows break? Let's say that's my first fear. I'm allowed to challenge that one. Well, you would go and stay at your mother-in-law's house and call SES or whatever. But then any other thought that comes along, I'm no longer allowed to challenge it, because that's just fueling the anxiety. And that applies to probably any anxious thought. But then it was also following through with, okay, now what would somebody go and do that genuinely believe that I have a solution to my first thought? They're just going to go and turn the TV back on and keep watching it, or they're going to go to bed, or they're not going to look up on the weather app, when's the wind meant to calm down. Have done numerous times. And I think that that's, again, just reminding people, when you really think about your worry and you think about what are all the behaviors that you do that are just maladaptive coping mechanisms that are really basically fueling that fear, I think that's the biggest thing that people are missing out on when they say they've done everything. I think it's about matching, well, I'm challenging every thought that I have and I'm saying that this is good for me and but it's about, they're kind of waiting for that thought challenging to make them miraculously go, not scared of that anymore, or okay, I can exercise now, instead of kind of accepting that two realities can exist at once and you can still be really scared and go regulate your nervous system. You can still be really scared and get on the airplane. You can still be really scared and nervous and anxious and whatever emotion you're experiencing and do the thing. You don't have to wait for that miracle thought challenging to make you suddenly not scared. It's kind of not the point.
No, it's not the point. And it's probably quite unrealistic.
Yeah.
I think you're right. You know, many people are just waiting for the strategy to help them feel better so they can do the thing.
Yeah.
But it's
I'm going to highlight that sentence because that is the most powerful thing in a nutshell that I took away from our work together. you can do all the strategies you want, Michaela. But if you don't do the behaviors to match them, redundant. But knowing the reverse as well was actually powerful. At first, I was a bit scared by that because I'm like, that's so much pressure. It means I have to actually not ask the question to the flight attendant or not Google this or not. But realizing actually the power in I can still do none of the strategies and be fucking petrified. But if I just don't ask the flight attendant one single question and I land and I'm safe, that in itself is going to make more of a difference. And I just think it's really, really, really important for people to understand that it's matching the behaviors.
Yeah. And we don't need to do everything, right? Any little step is in the right direction.
Yeah.
And so it can be really scary to think, oh, well, you know, I've got this suite of behaviors that I'm doing. I don't get to do any of them. And it's like, well, we can take this at, you know, at any pace that we need to, as long as we are making those incremental steps.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for
You're
your time
welcome.
today. I feel like there's a lot of nuggets in there for every single human to take on, even if you're not struggling with your mental health. But I really, really loved having this discussion. So thank you for being here.
You're most welcome. And well done on all of your great work.
Thank you so much. And I will see you guys in the next episode.